Histories of the Great Hunger rarely, if ever, focus on how Irish people survived the Great Famine of the 1840s. We so often talk about how people died, the numbers of people died, and those statistics are truly staggering. Somewhere between 1 in every 8 and 9 Irish people perished in the late 1840s. But ultimately, the famine is a story of survival. The vast majority of people who lived through it did survive. And in this video, I want to explore how people did survive, and also that'll lead us on to why we don't really talk about it very much, because some of these stories are darker chapters from our past. It's a really fascinating part of our history, and it really cuts to the heart of the Great Famine as well. Now, before we get into this, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Finn Dwyer. I'm an Irish historian. I'm also the creator of the Irish History podcast, so if you're looking for more long-form content, you'll find a link to that beneath this video. Here on YouTube, I'm making a series at the moment about the history of the Great Famine of the 1840s. I've covered lots of different aspects in the videos so far. I've covered big picture stuff about how the famine began and also some of the more forgotten aspects. The last video, for example, looked at the mental health crisis in Ireland in the aftermath of the famine. Now, if you like the sound of this content, do subscribe to the channel. We've already passed 40,000 subscribers. Thanks to everyone who's subscribed so far. I've got some really great plans about content coming in the next few months, so please do subscribe to the channel. It really helps out. And finally, I will say thanks for your time for tuning in. I really appreciate it. So in this video, I'm going to look at some of the ways Irish people survived the Great Hunger. And I think to fully appreciate why we don't talk about it, it's worth exploring a little bit about how the famine affected day-to-day life, something I haven't really spoken about in this series so far. But basically, the famine was one of the most degrading things that happened to Irish people over the last few centuries. Famine is an awful thing. It breaks down solidarity between people. Oftentimes you can't help your neighbours, your loved ones or your friends to survive. There simply wasn't enough food, or people didn't have the money to buy enough food that everyone could survive. And oftentimes that meant that if one person survived, it pushed maybe their friends, their loved ones, their neighbours further and further into poverty, destitution and danger of death. So that maybe contextualises some of the awful decisions that people had to make in terms of how they would survive the Great Hunger. But now I want to turn to a few different examples of this, and the first is one that you will probably know quite well. So one of the most common strategies to survive the Great Hunger was actually to leave Ireland. We often think of emigration in different terms, but ultimately it was a strategy for surviving the Great Famine. So between 1845 and around 1860, over 2 million Irish people left Ireland. And as I say, this was a really effective way of escaping the famine. Basically, you remove yourself from that situation. Now, when we talk about emigration during the famine, though, we often talk about Irish people who emigrated. You know, obviously it is Irish people, but there is a breakdown that we can make within that cohort of people who emigrate, because there's a lot of people who can't actually afford to leave Ireland. Crossing the Atlantic in the 1840s cost, around 40 shillings. Going to England cost substantially less, but it still cost money. And obviously during the famine, there was lots of people who didn't even have enough money to eat, let alone buying passage on a ship across the Atlantic or across the Irish Sea, and all the other costs that would incur. And these people were often trapped in Ireland, unable to leave to escape the famine, and often with very little resources to buy food in Ireland to try and survive through the late 1840s and into the 1850s. And next I want to look at some of the ways they survived, because this is where the story gets a lot darker and more complex, and perhaps explains why we don't talk about it very much. If you found yourself in Ireland in the late 1840s, destitute and facing starvation, one of the ways you could try and survive was to get into an institution, like a workhouse or a prison, because in that institution you would be given food. Now, I've already made a video on workhouses, and we saw in that how dangerous workhouses in particular were. Over 300,000 Irish people died during the Great Famine in workhouses. A lot of this had to do with the overcrowded conditions and the fact that a lot of ill people, often infected with typhus, slept in dormitories, so disease spread extremely rapidly in workhouses. Now, another more forgotten way that Irish people would try and survive the Great Hunger was to commit a crime and get admitted to prison. This is obviously something that people don't necessarily want to talk about too much, particularly that generation who survived the famine, but we've got countless examples of this. I'm going to put a couple of them on screen now. So for example, this did happen even before the famine, where really poor people would try and get into an institution, particularly a prison, in order to get food and a bed, basically. So you can see this article here. This is from 1842 in Dublin, where a woman broke a pane of glass. That was actually a very common thing that people would do, is they'd break a pane of glass and that would get them admitted to a prison. This woman in this article actually references a workhouse, that she wants to get admitted to a workhouse, but ultimately if you commit a crime like that, you're going to get put into a prison. Now, if we fast forward a couple of years into the darker years of the Great Famine, these type of crimes increased dramatically. And I've got another example here. This is from Kilkenny in 1847. where another person breaks a pane of glass in the hope that they're going to get admitted to a prison. Now, prisons were actually much, much safer than workhouses. Prisoners were obviously kept in smaller cells. There might be several people in the one cell, but you're certainly not going to be sleeping in a dorm with 40, 50, 100 people in that cell. So oftentimes prisons were actually safer places. And on top of that, you were also guaranteed food. And that was one of the main reasons that people would try and get admitted to a prison. Now, alongside prisons, people also committed crimes to try and emigrate. Why would they do that? Well, basically, if you look at this article here, this is where someone commits a crime and they're asking the judge not to send them to prison, but they're asking to be transported. Transportation was a form of punishment that existed in Ireland in the 1840s and before. It was actually being phased out in the 1840s. But for certain crimes, you would be transported to penal colonies in Australia. And for the poorest of the poor, this was a way they could emigrate. They could commit a crime and then ask the judge to transport them to Australia. However, a lot of crimes didn't carry that sentence. It was only certain crimes that did. And in many ways, this was just a plea for help from the absolutely destitute in society. Now, next, I want to move on to something else a bit more controversial, and that was where people took the farms of people who had died or emigrated. During the Great Famine, the population drop in Ireland was absolutely staggering. I've talked about this time and again in various different videos on this channel, but you get about 1 million people dying in the late 1840s, early 1850s, and then about 2 million people emigrating between 1845 and say 1860. But this leaves a lot of land empty in Ireland, and for people in Ireland who managed to hang on in the country, be they very destitute or also, it should be said, the not so destitute, they see the farms of these people as a way that they can, I suppose, survive the famine and then prosper in the decades that follow. So what they want to do is enlarge their farms by moving on to the farms of people who had died or emigrated. However, this was a pretty complex and controversial thing in Ireland at the time and then in the decades that followed. So, for example, the reasons why some of those farms were empty and those people had emigrated or died was because they had been evicted by their landlords. And to take the land of someone who had been evicted in Ireland was a major taboo. You would be called a land grabber, and later in the century in particular, you could be targeted by other community members for doing this. So people didn't want to recall this, that essentially they had taken over the farms of people who had died or emigrated, because there was a big taboo around this. Now, in the 1840s, it's a very complex thing. If you and your family were starving to death and you saw the farm of an evicted neighbour as a way to survive, what would you do? However, it's not always that complex. There were certainly people in Ireland who were not starving to death, who took over the farms of evicted people in order to profit from them and to become even wealthier in the aftermath of the famine. So that whole area is very complicated, very controversial, and there's lots of reasons why, particularly in late 19th century Ireland and early 20th century Ireland, people did not want to talk about this. They did not want to bring up how their families had survived because it brought up painful memories. Now, the last strategy for survival, if we call them that I want to talk about in this video is charity. There is another way people survived. I'll mention it at the end. It's a bit more controversial than anything I have talked about, and I'm going to explain why I'm going to make a separate video on that, because it's a pretty sensitive topic. But next, I do want to talk about charity, because that's a really well-known aspect of the Great Famine, but we never think about it from the perspective of the people taking the charity. Another really common way people survived the Great Hunger was because of the charity of others. Now, we often think about the famous cases of people who gave charity during the Great Hunger, particularly the case of the Choctaw Native American tribe who sent money even though they themselves were suffering a terrible treatment at the hands of the US government. And this is often held up as a great example of humanity in times of hardship. There's also lots of other examples as well. There was an example of an enslaved community who sent money as well. I'm going to make a video on these groups of people because they are phenomenal stories. But on top of that, you get donations from all around the world, from even regiments of the British Army in India. There would have been a lot of Irish people in the British Army in India, so you get money coming back from there. You also get amazing efforts by the Quaker community in Britain to raise money and then come to Ireland and help people survive. But we never think about these acts of kindness from the perspective of the people receiving that charity. And in many cases, people didn't want to talk about this. This was humiliating. It was degrading. They wanted to support themselves, but they couldn't. They were absolutely destitute. They couldn't support their families. They couldn't support themselves, and they had to take charity from others. And I don't think any of us ever want to find ourselves in that situation. So we rarely discuss and think of charity in the Great Hunger in those terms. As I say, we often focus on the act of giving, which is amazing, and it is something we should celebrate, certainly given some of the people who gave money were really in desperate and dire straits themselves. But it is interesting to think about why we don't look at it from the perspective of the people receiving that charity. And I think afterwards, no one wanted to really dwell on this. I think that generation who survived the famine, they were the ones going to pass down those stories of how they had survived. And it's very easy to see why they didn't want to share a lot of the stories that I've talked about so far. Now, I did say there was one other way that people survived the Great Hunger. It wasn't very common, but it certainly did happen. And that is what's often referred to as survival cannibalism. It did exist during the Great Famine in Ireland, and indeed it's pretty common in most famines all across the world. But I'm not going to address that in this video. It's a very sensitive topic, and obviously it's quite distressing as well. So I am going to make a completely separate video on that to look at the examples where it did happen, why people did it. It's certainly not something that should be sensationalized. It's the act of truly desperate people in dire straits that were forced into these situations. So I am going to look at some examples of that in a separate video, but I feel it does require a sensitive way of telling that story, and I need to think about it before I make the video. Finally, thanks again for tuning in. I really do appreciate your time, and subscribe to the channel if you want to get the next video when it drops.